Tendai had served as personal assistant to Babatunde, founder and chairman of one of the largest financial holding companies in the country, for nearly 6 years, before his employer asked him to help orchestrate a deception so elaborate that Tendai spent the better part of a sleepless night wondering whether he had somehow misunderstood the request entirely. Babatunde had built his financial empire from a single modest consulting firm 3 decades earlier, growing it steadily through careful decisions and an instinct for trustworthy partnerships that had made him a respected, if increasingly weary figure throughout the country's business community. He had married Monique relatively late in his career, nearly 15 years earlier, drawn to her elegance and apparent sophistication, at a time when he had grown increasingly aware of the emptiness his relentless work schedule had left in his personal life. And though their early years together had seemed genuinely happy, filled with the kind of easy companionship he had rarely experienced during his decades of prioritizing business growth above all else, he had noticed, gradually and almost imperceptibly, a shift in her demeanor as his company's fortunes grew ever larger, a shift he had spent years quietly attributing to the ordinary erosion of romance that long marriages sometimes experienced rather than anything more troubling. In recent months, that same instinct for reading people accurately, the very skill that had built his fortune, had begun quietly flagging something troubling much closer to home, a growing unease about his wife Monique that he could not entirely articulate, only a persistent, uncomfortable sense that her affection had grown noticeably warmer whenever conversations turned toward his company's finances, and noticeably cooler during the rare moments he attempted to discuss anything beyond his professional achievements. "I need you to help me disappear for a while, Tendai," Babatunde said one evening, seated in the quiet privacy of his home office, the city's skyline glittering faintly through the tall windows behind him. "Not literally. I need the world, including Monique, to believe I am traveling abroad on an extended business trip while I remain here in this very building, disguised as a member of the janitorial staff." Tendai listened carefully, weighing the request against the loyalty he had built toward his employer over 6 demanding years, a loyalty grounded not in blind obedience, but in genuine respect for a man who had, despite his considerable wealth, always treated Tendai with a fairness and consideration he had rarely encountered elsewhere in the corporate world. "May I ask what prompted this, sir?" Tendai asked carefully. "A feeling I cannot yet prove," Babatunde admitted, "but one I have learned over 30 years of building this company not to ignore simply because it remains unproven. Something about Monique's behavior has shifted in ways I cannot explain through ordinary marital distance. I need to see, honestly, what happens within these walls when she believes I am thousands of miles away and entirely unable to witness it." The plan Tendai helped construct over the following days required meticulous attention to detail. Babatunde would publicly depart on a business trip to Europe, his corporate jet documented departing the airport by several employees who would unknowingly confirm his absence to anyone who inquired, while in truth he would remain in the city, quietly checked into a modest apartment Tendai arranged under an assumed name. Each morning, he would arrive at his own company's headquarters dressed in the plain gray uniform of the building's cleaning staff, his silver-streaked hair tucked beneath a simple cap, his confident executive bearing deliberately dulled into the unremarkable, unhurried posture of a man performing labor no one at the top of the company ever paused to notice. Only Tendai would know the full truth of the arrangement, serving as the crucial link between Babatunde's true identity and the elaborate cover story maintaining his supposed absence. You understand, Tendai said carefully, during one of their final planning conversations before the disguise began, that if this reveals something painful, there will be no way to unknow it afterward. I understand that completely, Babatunde replied, his expression carrying a quiet, resolved sadness that had clearly been building for weeks. But I have built an empire on the principle of confronting uncomfortable truths directly, rather than allowing convenient assumptions to guide decisions with such enormous consequences. I would rather know the painful truth about my marriage now than continue building a life around a comfortable illusion that could unravel far more destructively later, when considerably more than my own heart is at stake. The disguise began the following Monday, and within his first week moving invisibly through the very headquarters he had built from nothing, Babatunde found himself absorbing lessons about his own company that no boardroom report could ever have taught him. Overhearing candid conversations among employees who spoke freely in the presence of cleaning staff they considered incapable of understanding or repeating whatever they discussed, witnessing small kindnesses and small cruelties alike playing out among people who had no reason to perform for an audience they believed held no consequence for their behavior. He noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that several of his senior executives treated the cleaning staff with genuine courtesy, remembering their names and asking after their families during brief encounters in hallways and elevators, while others, he observed with considerably more discomfort, moved through the building as though the janitorial staff existed as little more than ambient furniture, unworthy of acknowledgement or basic greeting. He filed these observations away carefully, understanding that his true purpose for the disguise remained focused on Monique rather than his broader workforce. Though he could not help feeling that the accidental education in his own company's culture carried a value entirely separate from the painful discovery he was about to make. Tendai maintained careful, coded communication with him throughout each day, relaying company matters that required his attention under the guise of routine administrative updates, while quietly managing the increasingly complicated logistics of keeping Monique convinced her husband remained safely overseas. It was during his second week in disguise that Babatunde's quiet observations transformed into something considerably more alarming than simple marital distance. Monique began visiting the company's headquarters with unusual frequency, always in the evenings, always requesting access to the executive floor's private VIP suite, a space typically reserved for confidential board discussions and high-stakes negotiations with the company's most significant partners. She informed the building's security staff, with practiced confidence, that she needed the space for personal matters related to organizing a surprise celebration for her husband's eventual return. A story plausible enough that the security team, unaware of any reason for suspicion, granted her access without question. Babatunde, assigned to clean the executive floor's windows and common areas during those same evening hours, found himself positioned, entirely by design of his own elaborate test, close enough to the VIP suite to observe far more than he had originally anticipated discovering. Through the suite's partially frosted glass walls, working methodically with his cleaning cart just outside the door, he watched his wife greet a man he recognized instantly, despite the deliberately dimmed lighting of the room. Sterling, a rival businessman whose aggressive attempts to acquire portions of Babatunde's company had been quietly rebuffed by the board on multiple occasions over the past several years. Sterling had built his own reputation throughout the industry as a man who pursued acquisitions with a ruthlessness that bordered on predatory. Having successfully absorbed several smaller companies over the years through tactics that skirted the edges of legality without ever quite crossing into territory that regulators could definitively prosecute, and Babatunde had personally clashed with him on multiple occasions throughout industry conferences and negotiation tables, each encounter leaving him with a distinct, uneasy impression of a man who viewed every relationship, professional or otherwise, as simply another asset to be leveraged toward his own advancement. Their greeting carried an intimacy that extended well beyond professional courtesy, Monique's hand lingering against Sterling's arm a moment longer than any business relationship required. Her laughter at his low-voiced comments carrying a warmth Babatunde had not heard directed toward himself in longer than he cared to admit. He continued his careful, methodical cleaning of the windows just beyond the suite's door, positioning himself close enough to catch fragments of their conversation through the imperfectly sealed glass, his heart hammering with a mixture of heartbreak and a cold, calculating clarity that reminded him uncomfortably of the same instincts that had once identified fraudulent business partners decades earlier in his career. "The board will never approve a voluntary sale of that magnitude," he heard Monique say, her voice carrying the same practiced confidence she typically reserved for hosting elegant dinner parties rather than discussing corporate strategy. "But Babatunde trusts me with access to certain documents he shouldn't. I can retrieve the authentication codes for the majority shareholder accounts before he returns from his trip. Once you have those, the transfer becomes considerably simpler to execute quietly, before anyone on the board even realizes what's happened." "And your husband suspects nothing?" Sterling asked, his tone carrying the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he had already secured his victory. "Babatunde suspects nothing beyond his precious quarterly reports," Monique replied, her laughter cold and dismissive in a way that struck Babatunde with far more pain than any accusation of infidelity alone could have delivered. "He's far too consumed with building his legacy to notice what's happening directly beneath him. Men like him always assume loyalty is simply owed to them because of how generously they provide for the people around them. He never once considered that generosity and genuine partnership are not the same thing." Babatunde felt something harden inside him as he absorbed the full scope of what he was witnessing, no longer simply a wife's emotional betrayal, but a calculated conspiracy to defraud the very company he had spent 30 years building, using access and trust she had been granted specifically because of the marriage she now seemed prepared to weaponize against him entirely. He continued cleaning the windows with steady, unremarkable movements, careful not to betray any hint of the devastating clarity settling over him, while mentally cataloging every detail of the conversation, for the confrontation he now understood was inevitable. He relayed everything to Tendai that same night, meeting his loyal assistant in the modest apartment where his disguise required him to sleep each evening, recounting the conversation with the same measured precision he would ordinarily apply to reviewing a quarterly financial report, though Tendai could see clearly beneath his employer's carefully maintained composure the raw devastation the discovery had inflicted. "We need documentation beyond what you overheard, sir," Tendai said carefully, understanding immediately the legal complexity such an accusation would require to withstand scrutiny. "Their conversation alone, however damning, will not survive a courtroom or a boardroom challenge without corroborating evidence." "I know," Babatunde said quietly, "which means I need to continue this disguise longer than either of us originally intended, Tendai. I need to gather proof substantial enough that neither Monique nor Sterling can talk their way out of what they've planned." Over the following 2 weeks, Babatunde and Tendai worked together carefully to construct an airtight case against the conspiracy unfolding within his own company. Tendai, drawing on his access to the building's security infrastructure through his legitimate role as executive assistant, arranged for discreet recording equipment to be installed within the VIP suite under the guise of a routine security system upgrade. Equipment that would capture, with irrefutable clarity, whatever further conversations Monique and Sterling conducted, believing themselves entirely unobserved. Babatunde continued his janitorial disguise throughout this period, gathering additional fragments of conversation during each of Monique's subsequent visits, watching with a controlled simmering fury as the scope of the scheme revealed itself gradually, the specific shareholder accounts targeted, the timeline for the illegal transfer. The considerable sum Sterling had promised Monique in exchange for her assistance securing access to documentation she had no legitimate authority to share. The scheme reached its planned culmination on an evening Monique and Sterling believed marked the final decisive meeting before executing their fraud. Gathering once more within the VIP suite to finalize the authentication codes Monique had successfully extracted from Babatunde's private study during one of her supposed evenings spent organizing his welcome home celebration. Unbeknownst to either of them, Babatunde had arranged, through Tendai's careful coordination, for Chief Adebayo's counterpart on his own company's board, a longtime friend and legal advisor named Solomon, to be present in an adjoining office, prepared to witness and formally document whatever unfolded once Babatunde chose to reveal himself. As Monique slid a folder of authentication documents across the table toward Sterling, her voice carrying the satisfied confidence of a woman who believed her plan had succeeded entirely undetected. The suite's door opened, and Babatunde stepped inside, no longer wearing the plain gray uniform of the cleaning staff, but dressed instead in the commanding, unmistakable attire befitting the chairman he truly was. His presence transforming the room's atmosphere instantly from triumphant celebration into frozen, horrified silence. "Babatunde," Monique stammered, rising from her seat so quickly that her chair nearly toppled behind her. You're supposed to be in Europe. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain." "You can certainly try," Babatunde said, his voice carrying a calm, controlled fury far more unsettling than any raised shout could have delivered. "Though I suspect the recording equipment installed in this very suite for the past 2 weeks has already documented a considerably more accurate explanation than whatever story you're preparing to offer me now." Sterling's confident composure shattered instantly at the mention of recording equipment, his eyes darting toward the suite's corners in belated panicked search for whatever devices had captured his own voice discussing the illegal transfer of shareholder assets in explicit damning detail. "This is absurd," he attempted, though his voice carried none of the smug certainty it had held only moments earlier. "Whatever you believe you've recorded proves nothing without proper context." "It proves everything, Sterling," Babatunde replied, stepping further into the room as Solomon entered behind him, formally documenting the confrontation as previously arranged. "It proves a calculated conspiracy to defraud shareholders who trusted this company with their investments. It proves my own wife extracted confidential authentication codes from my private study under the pretense of planning a celebration for my return. Codes she intended to hand over to a competitor who has spent years attempting, unsuccessfully, to seize control of an empire he never built and never earned." Monique's composure crumbled entirely, tears gathering in eyes that Babatunde now recognized, with painful clarity, had likely never carried the genuine affection he had once believed they held for him throughout their marriage. "Babatunde, please. Whatever you think you understand, our marriage was real. I do care for you." "You care for what I provide," Babatunde interrupted, his voice quiet now, carrying more sorrow than anger. I spent 2 weeks disguised as a janitor in my own company, Monique, invisible to you entirely. And in that time, I learned more about your true character than 15 years of marriage ever revealed. You did not simply betray our marriage with Sterling. You conspired to steal from thousands of shareholders who trust this company with their retirement savings, their children's education funds, their entire financial futures, all so that you and a man who never respected either of us could profit from a fraud dressed up as opportunity. He turned towards Solomon, his voice shifting into the measured, decisive tone of a chairman addressing a serious legal matter, rather than a devastated husband confronting his wife's betrayal. I want this documented formally and delivered to both our legal counsel and the appropriate regulatory authorities by morning. Sterling's attempted acquisition and Monique's role in facilitating it will be prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allows. You would do that to your own wife? Monique asked, her voice rising with disbelief and desperation. Destroy me publicly? Over business you already have more than enough of? You made this choice, Monique, Babatunde said quietly. The moment you decided our marriage was simply a convenient pathway toward a fortune you believed you deserved more directly. I am not destroying you. I am simply refusing any longer to protect you from the consequences of a scheme you constructed entirely on your own. In the weeks that followed, the legal proceedings unfolded with the same methodical precision Babatunde had once applied to building his empire, the recorded evidence proving devastatingly comprehensive. Corroborated further by financial records Tendai helped assemble documenting the specific accounts Monique had accessed without authorization and the communications trail connecting her directly to Sterling's broader scheme. The board of directors, once briefed on the full scope of the attempted fraud, unanimously commended Babatunde's handling of the situation, several longtime members privately admitting they had harbored their own quiet reservations about Sterling's persistent interest in the company over the years, reservations that had never quite crystallized into concrete suspicion until the elaborate disguise finally provided undeniable proof. Sterling, facing charges of securities fraud and conspiracy alongside the collapse of his own company's reputation once the story became public, saw his own business empire unravel rapidly as partners and investors distanced themselves from a man whose ruthless ambition had finally been exposed for the world to witness. Several of his own longtime business partners quietly severing ties within days of the story reaching financial news outlets. Monique, though spared the most severe criminal penalties through a plea arrangement Babatunde's legal team ultimately negotiated, more out of a desire to avoid prolonged public spectacle than any remaining tenderness toward her, forfeited any claim to the marital assets she had once believed marriage alone entitled her to. The divorce proceedings finalized swiftly once the fraud investigation confirmed the full extent of her betrayal. Babatunde, in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, found himself grappling with a grief considerably more complicated than simple heartbreak, mourning not merely the end of his marriage, but the unsettling recognition of how completely he had misjudged someone he had trusted so deeply for over 15 years. He spent considerable time in quiet reflection during those difficult weeks, often seeking out Tende's steady, thoughtful counsel during long evenings at the office, grateful beyond measure for the loyalty and discretion his assistant had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. Qualities that stood in such stark, painful contrast to the betrayal he had just uncovered within his own marriage. You could have refused this entire plan, Tendai, Babatunde said one evening, several weeks after the confrontation, as the two men reviewed the final legal documentation together in his office. You could have told me my suspicions were unfounded, or simply declined the risk of becoming entangled in something so personally complicated. Instead, you helped me uncover a truth that has cost me considerably, even as it protected the company and thousands of shareholders who never knew how close they came to losing everything. You have never once, in 6 years, asked me to compromise my own integrity for your convenience, sir, Tendai replied. When you asked for my help this time, it was to confront an uncomfortable truth honestly, not to construct a convenient lie. That distinction mattered enormously to me, and it still does. Babatunde studied his loyal assistant for a long moment, recognizing, with quiet clarity, exactly the kind of character he had once mistakenly believed he had found in his own marriage. Integrity offered consistently, without performance, without calculation, without any expectation of reward beyond the simple satisfaction of doing what was right. The company will need a new head of strategic operations once this settles fully, he said finally. I can think of no one better suited for that responsibility than someone who has already proven, under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, exactly what genuine loyalty looks like in practice. Tendai accepted the promotion with the same measured humility he had brought to every responsibility Babatunde had entrusted to him over the years, continuing to serve the company with the same quiet integrity that had first earned his employer's confidence. Now applied to considerably greater responsibility within the empire he had helped protect from collapse. Babatunde, meanwhile, rebuilt his life gradually over the following years, more cautious now in matters of trust, but not entirely closed to the possibility of genuine partnership, having learned, through painful and elaborate necessity, exactly how to distinguish authentic character from carefully performed affection. Years later, when Babatunde occasionally recounted the story to close friends and trusted colleagues, always careful to protect certain sensitive details from public circulation, he described the week spent disguised as a janitor within his own company, not as the most painful chapter of his life, though it certainly ranked among them, but as the moment he finally understood the difference between people who valued him and people who valued only what he could provide them. A distinction that had cost him a marriage, but had, in its place, revealed the genuine loyalty of the people who had stood beside him honestly throughout the entire difficult ordeal. Chief among them, the steady, unwavering assistant who had helped him uncover a truth few men would ever have the courage to confront so directly.